Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my 2024 San Jose Sharks free agency preview. The entry draft is less than a week away, and free agency opens just a couple of days after that, and the Sharks have a very interesting free agency and off-season period ahead of them, because usually for most teams, at least most playoff teams, they're working up against the salary cap, and this has very much been the case for the San Jose Sharks for a lot of their recent history, and that cap ceiling for this upcoming season will be $88 million. But for the first time in a very long time, the Sharks aren't particularly worried about the cap ceiling, but instead are worried about the cap floor, because while there is a maximum amount of money a team can spend for a particular season, there is also a minimum amount of money that a team has to spend, which for this upcoming season is $65 million. The Sharks currently have a cap hit of $55.3 million, which means they need to spend at least or close to $10 million to actually be eligible for the NHL this upcoming season, to meet that minimum requirement, which, like I said, is pretty uncharted territory for San Jose. In terms of total amount of cap space, they've got $32.7 million, which means they can pretty much do whatever they want for this upcoming off season. Now, will they actually take that freedom and go out and make a ton of massive signings and massive trades? Probably not. They're definitely going to play it slow over these next couple of years before perhaps gearing up into the future. But at the moment, the fact that they have this freedom is some pretty new space that the Sharks as a franchise haven't actually seen in a very, very long time. If we talk about their current active roster, they've got about 10 forwards, 6 defensemen, and 2 goaltenders. It should be noted this only includes players who were on the NHL roster by the end of last season, including the injured players, so Vitek Vanacek at goaltending, Matt Benning on defense, and Logan Couture at forward, but it does not include players who were with the AHL squad at the end of last season, yet could factor into the main team this upcoming season, like Danil Gushin at forward or Shakir Mukhamadullin on defense. In either case, however, the Sharks do obviously need a couple of new faces and re-signed faces at forward/defense for this upcoming season, especially, like I said, since they do need to meet that cap floor with an extra $10 or so million invested. Let us start off on the restricted free agent side. The Sharks have many, many names to actually discuss here, and the top of the list is Luke Kunin at $2.75 million for the last couple of seasons. He does have arbitration rights, which does add an interesting situation, I guess, to the contract negotiating that is going on here. Realistically, Kunin was not really worth the $2.75 million that he was making for these last couple of years. In terms of offense, he's barely at a fourth line level, I would say. And in terms of defense, while the team seems to appreciate the effort that he puts out, his numbers do not back up anything of that nature. He was one of the worst, if not the worst, defensive forwards on the San Jose Sharks this past year. His possession numbers in general were just right at the bottom of the list. Nothing good. One could argue that it was his deployment, being faced with the defensive zone frequently compared to certain other players. That can be argued, but realistically, if you were a half-decent defensive player, your numbers would certainly look better than what Kunin put up this past season, so he's not very good. But the San Jose Sharks do seem to value what he brings from an off-ice perspective. So while I personally probably wouldn't bring him back, and even if I did, it would be at a very low dollar amount of like $1.25 million max, it is likely with the arbitration rights and everything like that, that'll probably come in at around what he was making this past season, and the Sharks will probably end up bringing him back at $2.75. When it comes to Filip Zadina, this past year he was on a 1-year prove-it contract after he had a mutual termination of his deal with the Detroit Red Wings a couple of years back, and the San Jose Sharks and Filip Zadina were likely left somewhat disappointed by the lack of offensive explosion that they may have been hoping for him this past season, but I'd say he put up decent enough numbers that it makes it slightly worth giving him yet another NHL contract at probably yet another just single year to do so, and he may be able to even get a slight raise out of that. Not quite what he was making back in Detroit, but close enough at around $1.5 million. This one, I don't necessarily feel super strongly either way. If he's brought back, I certainly won't hate the move. If he's not brought back, again, with the amount of names that the San Jose Sharks have factoring into their roster going into next season, I wouldn't even necessarily hate if he's not brought back, but we shall see what Mike Grier decides. Like I said, $1.5 million-ish is probably where one expects that value to come from. Then we have Thomas Bordeleau, really the first name on this list that I'm actually quite excited about. While Cunnin I don't really want back, and Zadina I didn't feel too strongly either way, Bordeleau is a player who I absolutely want to see get signed, and I absolutely want to see play in the NHL. He had a strong stretch of games at the end of last season. This wasn't a small sample size of just like 5, 6, 7 games, but instead he played over a quarter of this past season and looked like he belonged at the NHL level in so many of those games. In fact, he was one of the better Sharks forwards in many of those games, and while his offensive numbers don't necessarily back that up, I do think it was a bit of a case of just getting somewhat unlucky in a lot of those situations. So I am very hopeful that he'll make the Sharks top 12 going into next season. That would require a new contract, and it will likely be one of those prove it type of deals, $1 million probably for just a single year, and sort of kick the can down the line, see what he can do with potentially a full NHL season under his belt, and then see at that point what he's actually worth for more of a long-term type of deal, even if it's just a couple of years. Then we have Ty Dellandrea, who is a bit difficult to evaluate because he was not on the San Jose Sharks this past season. He was with the Dallas Stars. In fact, he was only acquired by the organization a few days ago and is now a restricted free agent here for San Jose. I suspect because of the fact that he does have a full year under his belt, he was on a very competitive Dallas squad, he's not going to be at just the $1 million, will deserve a bit of a raise from that, but probably not going to be eclipsing too far past 1.25, maybe hitting the 1.5 range. Should be a solid player for San Jose, but again, this is a contract that's likely just going to last a year and will reevaluate in a year's time. Next, we have Jack Studnicka. I have his name here because he is technically a restricted free agent for the San Jose Sharks who played NHL games this past season, but I feel very strongly about not bringing him back. If anything, it would be a minimum contract, but there's absolutely zero room for him. I mean, realistically, there wasn't even much room for him this past season, and yet for whatever reason, David Quinn consistently put him into the lineup, especially near the end of the season when he was doing very much nothing for San Jose. Mike Grier, I thought this was always a bit of a weird move to even bring Studnicka over to San Jose. It very clearly did not work out. I would be heavily surprised if he was on the Sharks roster this upcoming season, or at least on the main roster, perhaps as like an AHL type of guy he could be brought back, but actually getting NHL games, very, very, very unlikely. Then we move on to the defensive side of things. First up, we have Calen Addison, was picked up at the beginning of this past season to try and bring more of an offensive edge to the Sharks' back end that had been decimated by the departure of Erik Karlsson in the trade to the Pittsburgh Penguins. There was no signs of life offensively from the San Jose Sharks' back end prior to Addison being acquired, and there were zero signs of life from the Sharks' back end after Addison was acquired because he did nothing offensively. There was no spark, there was no excitement, there was no anything. Even if he had come over and been absolutely terrible defensively, but was actually able to contribute somewhat offensively, I would say it was a successful trade, but he was terrible defensively while also being terrible offensively. So in general, 1 + 1 equals he was terrible just all around. So I personally would not want Calen Addison back on the roster. I don't think he would particularly fit. There are a ton of other names that would be interesting. Not only would like the Sharks to call up Shakir Mukhamadullin, not only will Matt Benning likely be returning to the lineup fully healthy this upcoming season, but the Sharks might also be looking to sign an unrestricted free agent defenseman for themselves next year. There is no space for Addison. I would be remiss if he was playing over actual interesting names on the Sharks roster. So while Mike Grier might not want to get rid of this player who he had traded for at the beginning of the season, it is absolutely time to move on. If, and this is a massive if, hopefully, he is brought back, I can't imagine it's much more than $1 million. Then we have Henry Thrun, an interesting player here for the San Jose Sharks. Played a good chunk of this past season, over 50 games for San Jose. Once he was called up near the end of December, he pretty much played the rest of the season, barring injuries that he sustained. Was extremely inconsistent, but certainly showed himself to be an NHL caliber defenseman. So like with Bordeleau, like with Dellandrea, he'll likely get a 1-year deal, prove what you can actually do in a full NHL season when the Sharks are slightly better, not by much, but likely to be slightly better, and give him about $1.25 million at that for maybe a couple of years even. Then we have Ty Emberson. Now, this is a difficult one because unlike with Kalen Addison, I do think Emberson was actually pretty good for San Jose, one of the Sharks' better defensemen this past season, but the major issue was he just didn't play a lot of games, and not because he was randomly healthy scratch, but because he was dealing with a ton of injuries this past season. And the fact is that if you don't really get to play many games, you don't really get to prove yourself all that much. He was very good in the 30 or so games he got, but that is a relatively small sample size compared to a lot of other people. And I already mentioned that the Sharks have a lot of competition on defense, especially since they're probably going to be looking to make somewhat of a splash in unrestricted free agency come July 1st. I don't know if there's really much room for Emberson. I wouldn't be sad if he's brought back. In fact, I think that would be a decent move, but it is very, very possible that the Sharks are moving on from him. We shall see what happens. If not, his contract would likely come in at around $1 million. Now we move to the unrestricted free agency category. The Sharks do have a lot of those players on their team as well, but unlike with restricted free agents, you don't hold their rights. They can go wherever they want, and realistically, the Sharks probably would not have wanted to sign many of them. Players like Barabanov, LeBanc, Hoffman will test their luck elsewhere. Sharks not going to bring them back. In fact, the only unrestricted free agent who I would like to see brought back for the San Jose Sharks would probably be Justin Bailey. Even then, it is a bit of a stretch. Like I mentioned, there's going to be a ton of competition on the Sharks roster. There are a lot of names. It was already very difficult to sort of shorten it to just the 12 lists of the 12 players forwards to play for the San Jose Sharks in my mock lineup that I'll get to a bit later on, and Bailey was not a part of that. So if he doesn't really see much of a clear path to competing for an NHL spot with the San Jose Sharks, it is likely he'll go elsewhere, because I do believe he has proven himself this season to be a capable enough fourth liner for even some better teams in the league. But I would definitely not be disappointed to see him brought back. It would likely come in at around $1 million. Then we move on to players who were not a part of the organization this past season, and it needs to be noted that the San Jose Sharks, while they used to be a pretty interesting destination for free agents, now that they are a much worse team and they're right at the bottom of the standings in the NHL, and while a slight improvement is expected, it's not going to be all that much unless, everything, the stars align here for San Jose. So they're not a particularly attractive landing spot for a lot of these free agents, which means the San Jose Sharks would likely have to overpay for anybody that they want to bring over to San Jose. This is not a huge obstacle because, like I said, they have a ton of cap space. But again, you don't want to just be giving out $10 million contracts to players who are nowhere near deserving. You still have to remain in the sort of realm of realism here for San Jose, and so we shall see what they manage to pull off. The first of which, the only forward I have here that wasn't part of the organization before, is Cal Clutterbuck. I've always liked Clutterbuck as a player, a very physical type of guy who manages to ride the line very, very well. He has never been suspended in the past, and yet he is one of the leaders in the NHL in terms of all-time hits as a player. He could be the type of guy who's brought in. You don't necessarily have to play him every single game. He could be a healthy scratch every once in a while, but just having him in the locker room, being the type of guy who you can play when you want to maybe protect some of the younger guys, have him on the ice as a sort of deterrent type of guy, could be a very interesting option. I have him here at $2 million. He's not worth that much, like I said, but again, you gotta overpay. He's been with the New York Islanders for many, many years. To pull him away from that organization is not going to be particularly easy, so $2 million for him, I do think is relatively fair. We shall see if the Sharks will try to go that route, or if they'll focus primarily on trying to improve on the defensive side of things, which was a major issue for the San Jose Sharks this past season, and if they want to be even slightly better for the upcoming season, they simply cannot head into the next season with the same type of defensive core unless massive improvements were to occur, and so they'll be looking in free agency as their big splash to try and get to the cap floor. And the first option I have here is a former San Jose Shark, Dylan DeMello, actually one of the better defenseman in the unrestricted free agent class this year. In fact, one of the best in that regard, probably top 5 for sure. An underrated defenseman in the league, actually one of the better ones. It's just that he's been playing with the Winnipeg Jets for each of the past couple of seasons, and the Jets aren't the most highly talked about team in the entire league, but he's been very, very good from a defensive standpoint. Doesn't necessarily bring a ton offensively, but defensively quite solid. He would immediately become by far the Sharks' best defenseman on the roster if brought in. I have him at around $6 million, which is perhaps a slight overpay, but that is taking into account if the Sharks want to give him something like 4 to 5 years of a contract for this 31-year-old player. If the Sharks wanted to maybe fit more so in line with their rebuilding window and they wanted to go, let's say, 3 years for Dylan DeMello, this contract would probably rise to like $6.5 or $7 million. But the fact that DeMello is one of the likely more sought-after free agent defensemen, if a playoff team is looking to improve in this particular area, DeMello is one of the first players that they are likely to call to try and negotiate with. There might be a bit of a bidding war that the Sharks can get into, but I don't know if they would want to get into. But if the Sharks are looking to really improve in this area, DeMello could be one of, if not the prime choice for that. Then we move into a couple of other players coming in slightly lower for sure. We have DeMello's teammate from this past season, Brendan Dillon, also a former San Jose Sharks, brings a bit more of a physical aspect, even if he's not as good as DeMello from a defensive standpoint. I have him coming in at around $4 million, which is, again, like I've mentioned multiple times, a slight overpay, but something that is likely needing to be done to really drag him here. He's not going to have as much of a draw as a player like Dylan DeMello, so there's slightly higher chances that the Sharks might be able to get him. But we shall see what ends up happening. He would be a very solid second pairing, if not even technically forced onto the first pairing type of guy for the San Jose Sharks, who would certainly improve their defensive output. And then finally we have Ekman Larsson, not a former San Jose Shark, but at the very least someone who the Sharks are relatively familiar with during his time with the Arizona Coyotes in the earlier parts of his career, was one of the more underrated defensemen at that time, is used to playing on the West Coast, but his likelihood of wanting to come to San Jose, honestly, is still up in the air because of the fact that the NHL season, for whatever reason, here in late June, is still ongoing. Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals will occur on Monday between the Florida Panthers, which is the team that Ekman Larsson is on, against the Edmonton Oilers, and I imagine if the Florida Panthers are to lose and Ekman Larsson is to lose, he may very well want to try his chance in free agency with yet another contender to take yet another run at the Stanley Cup, perhaps even remaining with Florida. But if he is to win the Stanley Cup on Monday with the Florida Panthers, he will be much more willing to be going to one of these less competitive teams, one of these more rebuilding teams. That's when the San Jose Sharks would be able to strike. He's a very good option for them. Strong veteran presence would be a winner at that point. And I think the Sharks would probably be able to get him for around $4.5, maybe $5 million if they can make that work for like 3 to 4 years, lock him up for relatively long term that can have him around for a bit, and that would definitely help improve the Sharks' defense. But again, these are all options that are going to be difficult to come by, as they will obviously have a ton of other teams that will be interested in them, and a lot more interesting offers as well, just by the fact that the Sharks are a team not looking to make the playoffs now and even perhaps into the foreseeable future, while anyone else calling probably has higher playoff aspirations. But then we move on into a potential lineup for the San Jose Sharks for this upcoming season. Like I said, it was difficult to nail down the 12 players here, and I have a few names of at forward and defense who could factor into the lineup at that point as well for San Jose, but currently I have Eklund, Granlund, and Zetterlund together as the Lund line. I don't necessarily think these players need to be together for the beginning of next season. This could definitely be edited, but it seemed like a pretty gimme answer at this point. On the second line, we have Costin Couture and Will Smith. I have Will Smith playing on the wing in this situation just because of the Sharks' current center depth. This is, of course, considering if Logan Couture is healthy enough to actually play at the NHL level consistently next season. We do not know. His future is completely up in the air. On the third line, I then have Bordeleau with Celebrini and Dellandrea. Obviously, this is assuming Celebrini is drafted by the San Jose Sharks, which realistically, he definitely should be. I imagine they go with Macklin Celebrini no matter what the case is. And it is also assuming that he comes over to the NHL for this upcoming season. I have him with Bordeleau and Dellandrea. This might seem like a bit of a young and inexperienced line that you wouldn't necessarily want with Celebrini, but Dellandrea is a very hardworking and solid bottom six defensive type of guy, so I think it would still end up working out and could be a solid and very fun third line to watch for sure. And then on the fourth line, I've got Zadina playing with Nico Sturm, as well as the newest addition to the San Jose Sharks, Barclay Goodrow. That could be a defensive sort of fourth line that the Sharks don't necessarily play a ton of, but decent enough, even if Goodrow's numbers aren't particularly good defensively. Just you want to probably have him in the lineup, considering the fact that the Sharks did go out of their way to pick him up off of waivers. And then in terms of other options here, I do have Luke Cunnin. Like I said, the Sharks will likely re-sign him, and while I personally didn't find a top 12 spot for him, I imagine the Sharks coaching staff will somehow manage to put him into the lineup. Then, of course, a couple of other options. Justin Bailey, who I mentioned could be the re-sign there free agency-wise. And then, of course, Colin Graff was a player who the Sharks signed out of college near the end of last season. Didn't really show a lot in his short stint with the San Jose Sharks at the end of last season, so I couldn't really, in good conscience, play him in the top 12, but he's definitely an option. We shall see how he does in training camp and preseason. Defensively, I have Ferraro playing with Dylan DeMello. This is a bit of a dream. I don't know if the Sharks will be able to get DeMello. The chances aren't necessarily that high, but if they do, he could be a very cool option for San Jose and give their defense a bit more life to it. The second pairing, I have Thrun and Ruda, and then I have as a third pairing Matt Benning being paired with Shakir Mukhamadullin. I definitely think Mukhamadullin is ready to make that jump to the NHL level just based on the very short stint we saw from him this past year in the NHL, and hopefully the Sharks will give him that opportunity. If not, there are a few other names, of course. Mark-Edouard Vlasic is always available if the Sharks really want to go that route. There is also, of course, Kyle Burroughs, who I haven't really talked about here in this video because he is on contract for another year, but he's definitely an option. And then they also have Nikolai Knyzhov, somewhat forgotten for the Sharks, but he's also under contract for one more year, and while he'll likely spend time in the AHL, you never know what might be able to happen. And then on goaltending, there aren't necessarily other options here. It is likely that the Sharks will head into next season with a goaltending tandem of Blackwood and Vitek Vanacek. But like I said, this offseason will be very interesting for San Jose. We shall see how they actually manage to get to the cap floor. Will it be a big unrestricted free agent signing? Will it be a big trade to take on a contract that a team is looking to move? We shall see. But like I said, going to be a cool next few months to watch as we gear up for a hopefully exciting 24-25 season. Class dismissed.